Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Rise Above Justice Movement podcast. My name is Zachary Mallory, and I am the founder and the host of the Rise Above Justice Movement and the Rise Above Justice Movement podcast. Today, I will give a viewer discretion is advised due to the nature of the topics that we will be discussing. Today, I am joined by my new friend Dee, all the way from Canada. Dee, welcome to the Rise Above Justice Movement podcast.
Thank you, Zachary. It's a privilege to be here.
Absolutely. So, feel free to introduce yourself to our audience because I think by now our audience is used to hearing Canadian voices. And part of that is because my connections in Canada, which is Marley with Survivors for Justice Reform, which is how I was connected to you. I was inspired by your story. And during your pre interview, you talked about a number of different like intersectional points. And there's a couple that I know we'll dive into here in just a bit. But feel free to introduce yourself and begin walking us through your journey and what you're doing now.
Sure. So my name's Dee. I am a non-binary queer settler here in what is known as Canada. Um, like you said, there's a lot to my story, and so I'll just share the Coles Notes version to start us off, and then we can dive deeper into some areas of interest for you and your viewers. So in my early 20s, I was going to school at a community college for police foundations. I completed the diploma and started applying to law enforcement opportunities. I ended up securing a law enforcement position in Toronto, Ontario, and um, and then during the transition into law enforcement, I was working in like a club, like a pub and nightclub, and during my 24th birthday celebration, I had been sexually assaulted by a previous partner of mine. Um, and then I ended up going into law enforcement and moving away, but this harm that occurred had followed me into my career because the lengthy timelines of bringing cases like this forward to a court. So I was actively working in law enforcement when I got my summons to attend court as a witness in my own sexual violence case. Um, I did well in law enforcement and ended up getting actually really sick and needing to retire early. So I had about 7 or 8 years in law enforcement before I was retired. I focused on my health and wellness and healing, both physically, mentally, and based around this trauma I had experienced. And when I started looking for roles that I felt were of interest to pursue in another career, because I knew law enforcement was not going to be it, um, I came to realize community work is where my heart lies. So I re-enrolled at the ripe old age of 38 years to start my second college diploma, transitioned out of that, did an undergraduate in social development studies, pursued a bachelor of social work from that, and I'm currently um, in the middle of my master's of social work and critical leadership here in Hamilton. So yeah, that's about the Coles Notes. I'll add there that through my college, my second college experience in taking the social service worker program, part of that learning is experiential. So we do placements, which are like unpaid internships, to gain like the lived experience and learning at the same time. And I had the privilege of being placed with an organization in Kitchener-Waterloo called Community Justice Initiatives that champions restorative justice approaches to harm, crime, that kind of thing. They have several programs. My area was focused into the Revive program, which focuses on applying restorative justice practices to instances of sexual harm. So I'm also a restorative justice practitioner. I've been there for almost 5 years. And I often actually sharing my story is part of my work within the organization. So I'm just happy to be here sharing it with you all, because oftentimes when I'm sharing my story, it's kind of focused locally and in small groups. So it's nice to have a little bit of amplification.
Yeah, absolutely. And whenever I was first hearing your story and I heard the words law enforcement, I was like, oh, hell, this is going to go either one or two ways. This is going to be really good, or it's going to go sideways because I have my own experience with law enforcement. And then I learned the type of law enforcement that you were involved with. And I was like, okay, I can rest a little bit easier because I was like, this is going to go one or two ways. Now, do you feel that your career in law enforcement definitely opened up your eyes to paint like a bigger picture into what the systems look like, into what you experienced? Do you think that your experiences in law enforcement opened up that door into restorative justice and the need to recognize the need for restorative justice?
I think, yeah, absolutely. I think both my experience in working in law enforcement and my experience with engaging in the criminal legal system as a survivor of sexual harm have been pivotal in my exploration and transition to a more abolitionist future, and someone who really tries to embody restorative justice values in the way I do my work, do my studies, engage with everyday people like neighbors, family, friends, acquaintances. So I think my experience both in law enforcement and the criminal legal system have greatly influenced how I view justice and how I define justice. I also think that part of the reason I ended up getting so sick, because I think it was because there was like this inner conflict between my own definitions of what justice looks and feels and sounds like, and then that of the justice system I was upholding in my career. And I think there was tensions there that probably influenced my getting very ill.
Yeah, and I think you bring like this very unique perspective. And I'm so excited to kind of like do a deep dive into this because I think it's going to be a really good conversation. Walk us through your survivor journey and, navigating these systems as a survivor, and then kind of what you saw within those systems and what you saw, in your interactions with law enforcement, the courts, etc. Because there's one common thing that I see amongst the systems across the world, and that is the amount of injustice that survivors are met with whenever attempting to report. Whenever I was sexually assaulted at the age of 17, I attempted to go report to my local law enforcement, the local police department in which the city, the city within where I lived at. That was a struggle to say that, but my brain's just all over the place. But I was met with apprehension and I was met with judgment. And my mom was right beside my side, and this officer looks at me and she's like, "Well, were you not strong enough to fight him off, or were you not strong enough to fight back?" And I was like, "So victim blaming, but on the side of your cars, it states to serve and to protect. So who exactly are you serving and protecting whenever somebody who is sexually assaulted on Easter Sunday, mind you? Let's make sure we include that direct part because Christian nation." But
Yeah,
whenever you walk in and you're met with this apprehension and you're met with, the whenever, and I'll tell you this, I grew up watching Special Victims Unit. Mariska Hargitay, I adore her, I love her. But watching that show makes it look incredibly easy that you can just walk in and say, "Hey, I was raped," and they walk you into this room and they talk to you, and then you go through the court system and they make it look like a cakewalk. It's not like that. It's not reality, and I think that paints the reality. It paints a false reality, you know,
yeah,
and it definitely paints it in a way that's not factual, literally at all. Like, yes, it is a TV show. I understand that, but think about how many people watch that TV show. It happens to them. They go in, they try to report, like I did, and they're actually met with the total opposite of what they see on the TV show. You know,
right. And
so
yeah, you bring up a really good point, this influence. And I remember like when CSI first came out too, there was like this idea in everyone's head that like running fingerprints is like a 10-minute job when it's a little more involved than that. But because these shows have an hour to get across their story and their message of the day, it skews reality for those viewers. So I guess what I'll start with is share a little bit about my experience with the sexual violence, and then I'll take you through my thought process in reporting and what that looked like, and then I'll bring it to the criminal legal system and the engagement there. So I was working in the nightclub um, entertainment district. So a lot of our weekends were work. And it was my upcoming 24th birthday. I had a lot of friends who worked in the bars with me, bouncers, servers, bartenders. And we decided to host just a get together for all of us to celebrate my 24th birthday at a local pub. It was a very intimate, celebration. It was pretty much just folks that we worked with, and I believe maybe some friends from outside of that, but it was really lovely. Of course, alcohol was involved. Um, I had recently broken up with someone I had dated briefly. He also worked in the industry. He was someone who worked in the kitchen for the pub that I did front of house work for. And that's kind of how we met. And we broke up and it was amicable. We decided to, still work together in a productive, um, collegial manner. And so that evening on my birthday, I had a friend of mine who said, Dee, maybe we should, walk you home. And I said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. She was a peer of mine that I worked with very closely, and we were very close. And she said, okay, well, I'll walk you home and make sure you get home safe. My ex overheard this conversation and said, oh, well, I'm going to start heading home, so I'll walk with you guys and then I'll just continue on my way. Long story short, we got to my place. My peer, she had to take the keys from me to open my door. She handed them back to me. I started going up the stairs, and the door that she opened for me is automatically locking. So you need a key in order to open it. And from from what I understand, based on her story, is that my ex forced his way into the stairwell, closed the door, forced the door closed behind him, looked at my friend outside and said, "I'll take care of her." Um, and then my friend pounded on the door, tried to gain access, couldn't, and I don't know what happened after that. um, so yeah, so I had gone up the stairs, entered my apartment. I was halfway asleep. Um, I woke up at some point with him assaulting me. I screamed and kind of flung my arms around to get him off. That seemed to have worked. And I fell back asleep. And the next thing I woke up to were two of my closest friends who had been bouncers with me waking me up. They had been texting me, trying to get a hold of me, calling, and they couldn't. And they finally gained entry into my apartment and woke me up and were met with fists and screaming. Needless to say, they didn't need to ask for details as to what happened. It was pretty obvious to them what had occurred. Um, that the rest of that evening is quite fuzzy. I remember going to the hospital a couple days later. Just I was very sore and wanted to just make sure everything was okay. Um, so that was kind of the harm that happened. And then, this is someone who's already gone to college for law enforcement, has applications in with various law enforcement agencies, hoping to get a job in law enforcement. And this complicates things because in my head, I was thinking, what type of law enforcement officer allows themselves to be sexually violated like that? What type of law enforcement officer puts themselves in a situation that allows the harm to happen? So it was a lot of like internal victim blaming. Um, so I was kind of sorting through all of this for about 3 days, and I hadn't yet reported it. And the conclusion I came to after 3 days was, you know what? I've worked in areas like victim services, for instance. And what I realized I couldn't live with is the fact that I have an opportunity to report this and stop the harm from continuing and preventing possible future survivors or victims. Or I don't, and this harm might continue. So after 3 days of consideration of what my options were, and at that time, I believed my only options were to report it to the police or stay quiet. I ended up calling and reporting what happened. Um, I remember being picked up by an unmarked van with a male detective and a female, I believe, officer. Brought to one of the police stations, put in a very cold room, like one that you would imagine in a show like SVU, with like two chairs and a table. It was cold despite the fact it was August. I was freezing. Um, yeah, it was very interesting. I felt like I actually had a decent experience with the investigator, the detective, save and except for a few things that were said that only looking back now seemed kind of patronizing, like I was trying to explain what had happened in my own language, and I was encouraged to use like adult language, right? Like instead of me saying violating me, he wanted me to articulate how that actually happened. So being, I guess, exclusive in the type of language I was using. But overall, like I felt the detective did a good job. I felt, aside from feeling like I was being treated as the aggravator in this, outside of that like initial interview, everything else unfolded, I felt pretty well until I got to the courts. Um, so fast forward about a year and 4 months, I am now working in law enforcement. I have gone through my basic training, signed my contract. It's 3 or 4 months into my new career in law enforcement, and I get served with uh, a summons to attend court as a witness in my own sexual violence case. And again, as a law enforcement officer, like there's two things you're told when you're in law enforcement, and that's your value as an officer depends on your credibility and reliability in the court of law. So this was something that weighed significantly on me, testifying in my own sexual assault case. And I think like the weight of that combined with like the trauma I'd experienced, and then also the culture I was immersed in law enforcement, I think all of that combined kind of led to my getting very ill. Um, so I got summons to court. I attended court. I believe we were there for 1 or 2 days. There were other witnesses, like the two gentlemen who found me afterwards, my peer who had walked me home that night, and of course the perpetrator, who had hired one of the top criminal lawyers in the Tri-Cities where I was situated. Um, Long story short, I testified as a witness in my own assault, and the judge decided that while I might be credible, because I was under the influence of alcohol, I was not reliable. And I believe some of the words he chose to use was, "This could have all been just a bad dream." And I felt lost. I was questioning whether or not this was the type of justice I had just signed up to support my community with through law enforcement. I had I think you could call it like an existential crisis in that moment or shortly thereafter, where I was really confused and not really sure where to go with this. Um, so yeah, I ended up, kind of just burying myself in work, um, taking all the shifts I can get, like almost it was to like maybe a toxic level where, I was using work as a reason not to acknowledge the pain and trauma and hurt, um, using it as I guess a numbing agent, until it got me so sick I couldn't go to work anymore. So my body and mind kind of made the decision for me that law enforcement was not going to be it for me, and that's when I retired.
Thank you so much for walking, me through a bit of your journey. And it leads me to my next question. So the first time that you kind of learned about restorative justice, right? So think back to that very first instance that excuse me, that you realized restorative justice existed and as an alternative, what was that moment like for you whenever you learned that, oh, there is something else outside of the traditional reporting? What was that moment like for you?
I I'm trying to think back to the moment that, so to give some context, when I started my diploma at college for community social service work, I had known that CJI, or Community Justice Initiatives, was one of the organizations that took students on. And I knew that some of the work they did was in supporting people who have caused harm. And this was something that was both scary and intriguing for me because it got me thinking, could this have been an option for my harm doer to have taken some level of accountability for his actions and maybe even got some healing himself that I feel probably led him to causing the harm in the first place? So it was like this really strange, confusing moment, but I felt so inherently drawn to the work in working with people who've caused the harm. Like there was a visceral connection in my soul to this work. And I don't know that I can explain it any other way other than that. Like there was a need and a desire and a calling for me to look into this work, and that kind of was dipping my foot in the pool of restorative justice practice.
Which, walk us through like what working in those spaces has been like for you in the restorative justice spaces. What are you hearing people say? What are you seeing people do? Whenever they find out that these are these alternative methods. And then you're also a member of Survivors for Justice Reform. So walk us through, finding out about that organization and, just walk us through that journey as well.
Yeah, so when I started with Community Justice Initiatives, I started off by taking their group facilitator training so I could co-facilitate groups for people who have caused the harm. And at that time, um, there was like an understanding that if you did have lived experience with sexual harm, either as a perpetrator or survivor, that's not something you can disclose in this peer support group because that shifts the dynamics of power within the group. So the first group I did was for people who've caused harm. It was in the time of COVID, so we had to be creative in how we were delivering the group. Um, and so throughout the year, we met for 2 hours every week for about a year. And I had a co-facilitator I worked with every single week. Both of us had the same training. Um, she happens to be a very close friend of mine now, so that's also a little bonus that you get when you work in these spaces. Um, and what I got to witness was the human experience beyond the actions and the humanity behind the quote unquote offender. Um, I got to hear how the harm that some of these folks have caused have completely isolated them from family, community, supportive areas and agencies and workplaces and like everything surrounding them. And these folks are completely isolated. And I was thinking, like that can't be healing, right? Like you can't heal in isolation. I know you can't heal in isolation because I tried that when I was in law enforcement and I ended up retiring early. You heal when you're in community. And this was something that became very apparent as the year went on. And another thing I heard in this first year was people who had caused harm and who were taking accountability for the harm that they've caused. I heard accountability grow from, you know, yes, I caused harm to, oh my goodness, I didn't realize the impact that harm has. And then beyond, like, what can I do to prevent harm from occurring in the community, in spaces, right? So this accountability growth was something that was very apparent to me. And I feel like accountability, when you're talking about restorative approaches to addressing sexual harm, accountability has to be present, no matter how minuscule it might look like when you start. You have to have some accountability present in that space. Um, and then so I finished my year uh, as a placement student with community justice initiatives. I told them from about 2 months into the work that I'll never leave because I love the agency, the organization. I love the work culture. I love how included and valued I felt as someone who wasn't getting paid to do the work. So I transitioned from a student to a volunteer, and I've never looked back. Um, the first year as a volunteer, we started creating a program for people who have lived experience, both as a perpetrator of harm and survivor of harm, who wanted to offer options for people who wanted a restorative process, but perhaps their direct person or people were not able or willing to participate in a restorative process. So we created this program, and it's called surrogacy. And so now we have a roster of surrogates who have both lived experience with sexual harm, both on the offender side and the survivor side. And we work together in community with each other to promote healing and restorative justice options for people who otherwise might not be able to access that healing or restorative justice option. So working in that and working on the task group to create this surrogacy program, I was working with people who've offended very, very closely, and it became very apparent to me very quickly that these people were far more than their criminal record. These were people who actually cared, who volunteered their time to prevent harm from occurring in the community and to offer healing to those who have experienced harm. So like that to me was another piece to this puzzle that really has me, questioning my original idea of the criminal legal system and that's the way to address, community safety. Um, so that's kind of like where I'm with community justice initiatives. Through community justice initiatives, I learned of Marley Liss, who had been a champion of restorative justice approaches, who had lived experience with it. So I got to following Marley on Instagram and socials, and she dropped this hint that she was going to create a coalition a few months before Survivors for Justice Reform actually started. And I knew that the day the coalition was open for sign up, I would be the first on the list to sign up. First, second, or third, somewhere in there. One of the first few. And sure enough, I was. I joined immediately, and shortly thereafter, I offered to step up as one of the representatives for the Ontario chapter of the coalition. And this was an opportunity I felt that was very in line with restorative practices, in that like it was very community led, it's survivor focused and survivor led, which I think is what is really, really missing in the traditional criminal legal system we all know and love. And I use love loosely there. Um, so this was very much in tandem with the work I had been doing in restorative justice with CJI. And now I just get to talk about it a lot more and, you know, share my experiences and my knowledge and um, insights into how restorative responses can address things that the criminal legal system was never created to address in the first place. So yeah, I guess I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, absolutely. Think about that first call that you attended with the coalition. Okay. Think about that for a second. And what was that experience like for you attending that and hearing other people kind of talk about what restorative justice means to them? And you've attended several other meetings now, and I don't know if you have you done any events with like other people in Ontario with restorative justice, the Survivors for Justice Reform? Have you done anything like that just yet?
Not anything in person.
So it's
I'm
all been virtual.
Yeah,
Mhm.
my involvement has been virtual. I've responded to a few media inquiries, but nothing. I guess, like our coalition skill shares and stuff like that, our coalition-wide meetings,
Mhm.
our state rep meetings, and then of course the Ontario chapter meetings each month. Um, I do work closely with my representatives, so Lola and Jay, who are the Ontario chapter co-representatives alongside me. We together kind of hold this container for Ontario chapter members to do the work they deem is necessary and important to them. Um, but like going back to like that first call or like these first few meetings, I felt so relieved being in that space because I felt like I wasn't the only one pushing for these alternatives to addressing harm. Like for a long time, I felt really isolated. Like, so community justice initiatives is a fairly large organization considering it runs a lot on like volunteers and stuff. And I felt in community there, right? So when I was doing CJI stuff, I felt like I was in community. But outside of doing CJI stuff, I felt alone and isolated because most of the people I talked to about the work I did with CJI wanted nothing to do with it, right? When you tell folks that you're working to support people who've caused harm, that's for some people that's a really jagged pill to have to swallow. So I felt really isolated in the work. And then the second I hop on these calls with Survivors for Justice Reform, I felt like 80 pounds had been lifted off my shoulders because I'm not the only one doing the work. There are lots of other people out there doing the work. I just didn't have a way to access them. So, what Survivors for Justice Reform did was create a community of like minded people, survivor based, who all acknowledged and desired alternatives to the carceral criminal legal system that we previously thought was the only option. So I felt light and I felt connected and I felt inspired to further the work because now I'm not doing it alone, right? When you share the burden, it gets a little lighter and more tolerable to do the work. And that's how I felt, absolutely how I felt in the first few meetings. And I continue to feel that way. Every meeting I'm in with Survivors for Justice Reform chapter members, whether it's global or local, I'm continued to leave those meetings feeling inspired, grateful, connected, healed. Like these spaces offer healing and they don't even, that's not even the purpose of it. It's a byproduct of it, right? It's an it's an off-label side effect of it is healing.
Speaking of healing, I've said this numerous times on this podcast. I've said it numerous times on our social media. I've said it during interviews, but healing is not linear. It is complex because it looks different for each person. What has healing been like to you, and where are you at in your healing journey?
Yeah, so I said I'm a volunteer surrogate with CGI, and part of that is sharing my story. And I do talk about healing when I share my story and how healing will never be a destination and that how it's always an ongoing process. And I can't tell you what healing looks like because I don't know that it is a something that's can be articulated. What I can share is that I have grown significantly. And I think growth and healing are intertwined with one another. I think you cannot do one without the other. So, what healing looks like to me is living as my most authentic self. So previously, I was kind of like a serial monogamist, uh, female presenting, um, really leaned heavy on monogamous um, romantic relationships. Um, I am now non-binary, came out as gender non-conforming. I identify as asexual. I have no romantic partners and don't want any. Um, and I am feeling more validated living this way than I ever did seeking external validation through romantic partners. Um, so to me, the more I'm living my true self, the more I feel I'm healing and growing.
I thank you for stating that because I'm going to start phrasing that question a lot more. So, see, this is a learning experience for each person, and learning, different perspectives on different topics, I think has been the rewarding perspective of doing this podcast because I meet different perspectives and I start thinking about my own thinking. Like, okay, this is a different way to phrase that. So, first of all, thank you for everything that you do. Thank you for, coming on the podcast today and sharing your experiences and, just being this badass human being that, I've come to notice in a little short time. And I'm really excited to continue collaborating with you, continue, watching your growth and continue to, see you shine as a leader that you definitely present as. And I think it is very interesting to be in spaces that you're around people that just really get it and they understand different perspectives because the healing journey and the growth journey, I now that I think about it, I don't think healing is a journey or as a destination for me either. I think it's more of like growth and like overcoming, what who I thought I was and what I experienced at that time. I experienced a lot of that shame and a lot of that guilt and a lot of that, which a lot of survivors do. And they're like, what if I would have done this? What if I would have done that? Or if I wouldn't have put myself here or done this? But ultimately, one thing that I've learned throughout this journey is we cannot blame ourselves for something that somebody else does to us. And I've come to realize that. And I've I've coped with that. And I've learned how to overcome that and overcome that thinking. And now I'm educating others on how to get to that journey as well, even though it looks different for each person. I can share what worked for me. I stopped doing drugs cold turkey. Now, is that going to be the same for every single person? No. But I've been sober for almost 10 years, and I think that's definitely something worth celebrating, most definitely. And I think even, and it doesn't have to be something that big. I think celebrating those tiny victories, even though it may be tiny to some other people, it's not tiny to me. That's a very big fucking journey. But I think celebrating those small victories, overcoming different obstacles, I think that's definitely worth celebrating. And, with that, Dee, again, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I greatly appreciate your perspectives. I greatly appreciate the work that you are doing. And I'm excited, again, to continue watching your growth. And is there anything else that you wanted to share with people who may be listening right now? And then how can people also follow along on your journey? Like, where are you at on social media or any website or anything you'd like to share?
Um, Thanks for all that kindness you just sent my way. I'm feeling the love in this space right now, and it takes a certain type of person to offer space where these stories can be shared and in a good way. So first, I want to thank you, Zachary, for offering the space for me to share. And last words I would offer um, to folks who've been on the receiving end of kind of any type of harm. Really ask yourself what you need to heal and what that looks like for you, and try to seek that out, um, because for some the criminal legal system might work, and that's their prerogative, um, but really consider what healing looks like for you and what justice means for you, and seek that out. um, as for like getting in touch with me, I am on Instagram. I would highly suggest you follow me on Instagram. I'm at the Restorative DM. I'm also on LinkedIn. I can share that with you if you wanted to post the link for your listeners. Um, and you can also find my email on the Survivors for Justice Reform website on the representatives page. So that's drooke6433@gmail.com. And I welcome any questions, thoughts, feedback. Um, yeah,
All right, my friend. Thank you so much. And please take care of yourself. And I'll talk to you very soon. Okay.
thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.